All right, everybody, let's go ahead and finish up this week number 3, talking about most Americans' favorite drugs of choice, particularly the latter. We're going to go ahead and talk about nicotine and caffeine. So we're going to start by talking about nicotine. We'll talk about the history of nicotine and its use, the pharmacology, particularly with smoking, and then we'll finish up by talking about some of the different behavioral effects. At that point, we'll then move on to caffeine. We'll talk about its history and its pharmacology and behavioral effects. So I want to start with the quote for each of these two different drugs, and I'm going to start by talking about nicotine. I love this quote from Mark Twain. He was always very well known for his wit. "Giving up smoking is the easiest thing in the world. I know because I've done it thousands of times." So where does nicotine actually come from? So much like cocaine is an alkaloid that is found in the leaves of the coca shrub, nicotine is an alkaloid that is often found in tobacco leaves. And there are two different types of tobacco leaves that are involved here. So we have what's called large leaf tobacco. The species is Nicotine tabacum. This is developed in South America and it was domesticated over 5,000 years ago. And then we have a small leaf tobacco, which is Nicotiana rustica, that was developed in the West Indies and North America. Generally, it is the rustica variety, the small leaf variety, that was originally encountered during Columbus's expedition to the New World in 1492. So let's talk a little bit about nicotine's chemical structure. So nicotine, you can see here, it was isolated in 1828. Here is its chemical. And then here is the primary principal metabolite of nicotine. This is called cotinine. And you can see that there is a very similar chemical structure here. Tobacco was basically encountered by Europeans in 1492. Columbus wrote in his journal that his ship basically encountered a lone man in a canoe that was carrying with him a piece of bread as big as his fist, a calabash, which is a bottle-shaped gourd of water, a piece of red earth, powdered and kneaded, and a few dried leaves, which must be something of importance to these people because they brought me some in San Salvador. So what they ended up finding is that they would set these dried leaves on fire. The natives would set these dried leaves on fire and they would inhale and drink the smoke. And they kind of noted that they would become sleepy and drunk feeling, but it also really got rid of their tiredness. So basically, after Columbus's arrival to the West Indies, Europeans basically began to take up smoking as a result. So by the 1600s, England had commercialized tobacco. They were setting up shop in North America and colonizing North America at this time. And they ended up growing it in Virginia. Now, in Britain, initially, tobacco was really scarce and it was really expensive. So there were these early pipes that were sometimes called fairy pipes or elfin pipes, and they were really small so that you could conserve the dried leaves because at the time it was really hard to get. But smoking's popularity grew so much that by the early 1600s, there are thousands of shops in London alone where you could end up purchasing tobacco. Generally, this started with pipe smoking, cigar smoking, and later chewing, but this ended up being supplanted by snorting finely powdered tobacco leaves, and this is what is known as snuff. So Nicotiana rustica, England attempted to basically kind of grow it, but it ended up failing because the rustica species had a really bad flavor compared to the tabacum variety, the large leaf variety. John Rolfe ended up being able to find some of the large leaf tobacco, and that was how it ended up being grown in Virginia. So the small leaf tobacco didn't grow very well at the time in North America. They ended up planting some large leaf tobacco, and ultimately the American tobacco industry begins. By the 1800s, cigarettes started to become more popular. So there are two major developments that really kind of happened. So first, there was a method for curing tobacco leaves that ultimately enhanced their flavor, but additionally, the invention of the cigarette machine. So if you wanted to roll cigarettes manually by hand, it would take you could make maybe about 2,500 to 3,000 cigarettes per day. By 1884, a cigarette machine could make 120,000 cigarettes in one day, and modern day machines could produce 4,000 to 8,000 per minute. So the popularity in the United States ended up exploding soon after. And it has been argued that the invention of the cigarette machine by James Bonsack is ultimately what led to more cigarettes being able to be produced, it becoming cheaper to have them because they were much more accessible, and thus this would lead to heavy amounts of smoking in Europe and the United States. Now, this might actually be kind of surprising. So when nicotine was first isolated in 1828, it basically only constituted about 5% of the weight of dry tobacco leaves. But the typical cigarette also doesn't really have a lot of nicotine that reaches the brain. The average cigarette only has about 6 to 11 milligrams of nicotine, and generally only about 1 to 3 milligrams ultimately reaches the bloodstream. How much nicotine is available in the bloodstream ultimately depends on the user. So it's ultimately the smoker's behavior that affects how much reaches the bloodstream. So that includes how many cigarettes you smoke. Generally, the more that you smoke, the more of a dose you're going to get. It also includes the number of puffs that you take, how much you choose to inhale, and the length of each puff. So when we talk about nicotine, particularly with smoking cigarettes, we have to talk about the concept of tar. And that's because if you've heard about a lot of the negatives of cigarette smoking, you're largely going to hear a lot about the discussion of tar. So nicotine in tobacco is ultimately going to be vaporized by the high temperatures at the burning tip of the cigarette. Basically, the only way that nicotine can enter the lungs is basically on tiny particles of tar. Tar is a mix of hydrocarbons, and some of those hydrocarbons are carcinogenic. That means that they're cancer-causing. Tar is actually a really important contributor to the taste and the smell of smoke, and these sensory qualities, along with the delivery of nicotine, ultimately contribute to smoking's reinforcing effects. Now, once the smoke has been inhaled, nicotine is going to pass through the lungs, and then it's going to be absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, nicotine is going to be absorbed to a lesser extent when you chew tobacco or you snuff. So, like I said, after the lungs, nicotine is going to be absorbed into the bloodstream. So the surface of the lungs are very absorbent. They have a total surface area of about the size of a tennis court. And so what we're going to see here are the blood vessels. Here are the alveoli in the lungs. Here's nicotine. And from those alveoli, they are going to be directly passed into the bloodstream. So as I kind of mentioned, smoking rapidly delivers nicotine. Most typical smokers smoke about 10 puffs per cigarette at intervals of about 30 to 60 seconds. Each little puff is going to basically deliver a little burst of nicotine to the brain. So at a pack a day, so that's about 20 cigarettes. That's about 200 hits of nicotine. If you smoke 1.5 packs, which is 30, you're going to get 300 separate hits. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is how long it takes for that nicotine hit to reach the brain. Each hit reaches the brain in about 7 seconds. That is incredibly short. And to really impress this upon you, I want to compare how long nicotine reaches the brain with smoking with how long heroin reaches the brain through intravenous methods. So nicotine hits the brain from smoking at about 7 seconds. Heroin, through an intravenous method, reaches the brain in about 14 seconds. So the time that it takes for nicotine to reach the brain through smoking is actually shorter than it takes heroin to reach the brain through an IV method. This is a very short duration between inhalation and the effect. So I have nothing but sympathy for smokers who are trying to quit. We already know how hard heroin is to quit, and it has a longer duration between injecting the drug and it reaching the brain. Smoking is hard to quit because you have such a short duration between the behavior, inhaling, and the effect you get, and that means that you're going to get greater reinforcement. So how is nicotine basically metabolized? So nicotine, about 70 to 80% is going to be metabolized to cotinine by a very specific liver enzyme. In this particular case, it comes from the cytochrome P450 family. It is called 2A6, or it is abbreviated as CYP2A6. And one of the things that we know is that the amount of this enzyme that you have affects how quickly you are to metabolize it. So some individuals actually have very low CYP2A6 metabolism. They have fewer of these enzymes. As a result, they have a reduced nicotine metabolism. And these folks are less likely to become smokers. And if they do become tobacco dependent, they're going to smoke fewer cigarettes than people who have normal levels of CYP2A6. So slowly breaking down nicotine seems to have a more protective effect. It has been found, it was found in about 2011, that normal levels of CYP2A6 activity is associated with dependency and also a lung cancer risk because of more frequent smoking. So how is nicotine then eliminated? The half-life of nicotine is basically about 2 hours. That means that generally, again, 3 half-lives, you are going to be almost entirely cleared of nicotine in about 6 hours. So this is in general, this is obviously going to vary between individuals, kind of based on that CYP2A6 activity. But that's a pretty short half-life, all things considered. It's slightly longer than cocaine. So as a result, a user is going to have to smoke repeatedly throughout the day to basically avoid withdrawal. And withdrawal isn't deadly like it is for something like opioids or alcohol, but it's not fun. So we'll talk about those withdrawal symptoms later, but frequent smoking leads to increasing rising peak levels of nicotine throughout the day. So basically each dose is building on the residual nicotine from the last dose that hasn't yet cleared the body. But this doesn't cause a greater effect because tolerance develops. One of the things that we do find is that smokers might experience some mild withdrawal at night because 8 hours of sleep means the nicotine that you have in your system is going to be cleared while you're sleeping. And that tolerance from the previous day is going to dissipate. And typically what this means is that a lot of smokers are going to wake up in the morning and the first thing they're going to want to do is have a cigarette. They have a very strong craving for a cigarette. And additionally, that first cigarette that they have of the day is going to lead to the best response of the day and the strongest response of the day, because that nicotine, that tolerance has dissipated, and that buildup of nicotine levels means that they're totally depleted. So you're going to see that a lot of people who like to smoke really love that first cigarette of the day. So let's talk a little bit about the main mechanisms of nicotine action. So nicotine works on what are known as nicotinic receptors. These receptors are one type of acetylcholine receptor. So we talked about this in week 1. We have nicotinic receptors, which are ionotropic, and we have muscarinic receptors, which are metabotropic. So nicotinic receptors, they're ionotropic, so when nicotine binds to them, they open up ion channels, and they are largely going to respond to acetylcholine or nicotine. And one of the things that we do find is that high affinity nicotinic receptors can be found in various parts of the brain, as well as in the ganglia, the different cell bodies of the autonomic nervous system, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches. So one of the things that you might find kind of interesting about smoking is that smoking is a stimulant. It is excitatory in nature, but smoking ultimately creates a pattern of initial stimulation followed by a block. So high doses of nicotine are going to initially stimulate nicotinic receptors, and that's going to lead to continuous depolarization of the cell. So nicotine has excitatory effects on nicotinic receptors, and the neurons will continue to be depolarized. They'll fire more action potentials. However, at some point after this continuous depolarization, a depolarization block develops. What this basically means is that the cell becomes unable to fire until nicotine is removed. So high doses of nicotine basically have what we call a biphasic effect. There are 2 phases. You first get that initial stimulation, but then it turns to a nicotinic receptor blockade. And as we're going to talk about a little later, this is going to have some effects on things like nicotine poisoning, which can happen. So if we want to study the effects of nicotine on people, we often have to separate it from the actual aspects of smoking. And part of the reason for that is, again, the act of smoking is going to be very highly individualized. People are going to take different puffs, different puff lengths. They're going to smoke different amounts of cigarettes. And moreover, when you respond to smoking with a cigarette, you are not just responding to the nicotine that's delivered, you're also responding to the reinforcing effects of smoking-related paraphernalia and ritualistic behavior, like hitting your pack against your hand, syncing up your lighter, prepping your cigarette. So oftentimes, if we want to study the effects of nicotine alone, we're going to give people nicotine delivery methods besides smoking. So that includes things like nicotine injections, nicotine gum, patches, and lozenges. Now, early studies tended to suffer from current smokers. And part of the reason for that is that smokers are often asked, at least in these early initial studies that people did, they were asked to refrain from smoking between 8 and 24 hours. So a lot of these people were having withdrawal and during the study, and so it becomes unclear, is it because of the nicotine or is it because they're in withdrawal? So most studies are going to compare the effects between smokers and non-smokers when they're given nicotine. And one of the things that we do find is that for smokers who haven't smoked between 8 and 24 hours, nicotine tends to calm them down. If you've ever met a smoker, they will get very agitated and very irritable if they cannot have their cigarette. And for a lot of smokers, cigarettes will have a very relaxing, tension-reducing effects. But this could be due to relief from withdrawal. Now, compared to non-smokers, people who are not dependent upon nicotine, we tend to find that nicotine increases tension, arousal, lightheadedness, dizziness, and even nausea. And a couple of other things that we know is that smoking may actually affect cognitive function. And this is because nicotine acts on acetylcholine, and acetylcholine plays a major role in cognitive function. So what you're looking at here is data from a study in which abstinent smokers, so people who haven't smoked for a specified period of time, if they're given nicotine, they actually will show cognitive improvements. So this is an attention task. This is an attention task. And basically what they had to do, they delivered a nicotine patch looking at accuracy in a continuous test of attention. And so subjects had to basically respond as quickly as possible by pressing a key when a particular stimulus, like the letter X, was presented on the screen. And they were told, if you don't see that X, don't press a key. We call this a go versus a no-go task. So if you see the stimulus, go ahead, press the key. If you don't see the stimulus, no go. Don't press that key. And what we find is that people who are given nicotine, they make fewer errors of omission. So that means they're less likely, they'll be more likely to catch the target than not compared to people with the placebo. And they had you can kind of see that they also had more sustained attention in this task. So smoking may help people feel more of a sense of focus, and that's because of nicotinic receptors and their actions involving acetylcholine. Now, I kind of mentioned that one of the major problems with nicotine is that it's very hard to quit. And part of the reason for this, again, is that very short duration time between smoking and when that nicotine hit reaches the brain. One of the things that we do find is that nicotine is very highly reinforcing. Cigarette smokers will self-administer pure nicotine through IV injection. And again, that's kind of indicating that nicotine is reinforcing at the right dose. But they have also found self-administration in animals. In fact, nicotine self-administration has been found in rats, mice, dogs, and non-human primates. And the mesolimbic pathway, much like what we saw with drugs like cocaine, play a critical role. As a friendly reminder, the mesolimbic pathway is a dopaminergic pathway that originates in the ventral tegmental area, and it terminates at the nucleus accumbens. And it plays a very critical role in all of this. We find that there are nicotinic receptors in the ventral tegmental area that exert excitatory effects on dopaminergic cells and stimulate greater dopamine release onto cells in the nucleus accumbens. So the nucleus accumbens, again, is playing a critical role for these rewarding reinforcing effects. Researchers have actually found that if you lesion the nucleus accumbens in animals, they are less likely to self-administer nicotine. And one of the other things that we do find is that even inhaling the smoke has the same effect on the mesolimbic pathway. So even inhaling the smoke for people who are dependent on it can be highly reinforcing. One of the other things that we know is that it inhibits monoamine oxidase. Monoamine oxidase, as a friendly reminder, is an enzyme that breaks down dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, as well as serotonin. So monoamine oxidase is really important for the breakdown of dopamine and other neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine. So if we are inhibiting this enzyme from doing its job, that means that dopamine is staying in the system for longer, that norepinephrine is staying in the system for longer, and that serotonin is staying in the system for longer. And this may further increase the reinforcing effects that are felt. Now, just to kind of show you some additional evidence, what you are looking at here is a whole body PET scan kind of indicating reduced monoamine oxidase activity in the body. So here we have a non-smoker. Remember that warmer colors going towards red and yellow indicate more activity. Cooler colors, particularly those that are purple, have fewer activity. So take a look particularly at the brain, the lungs, the heart, and the liver and kidneys. And as you can see, a smoker has less concentration of monoamine oxidase compared to a non-smoker. So let's talk about what smoking actually ends up doing. So acetylcholine is the primary neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system. Acetylcholine is also involved in the preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system. So nicotinic receptors are ultimately going to contact the autonomic ganglia. So both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system will be affected. As a result, we know that there are going to be a wide variety of effects. Smoking cigarettes causes the adrenal glands to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And ultimately, that's going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. So you're going to get things like tachycardia, high blood pressure as well. Now, nicotine is also working on the parasympathetic ganglia. So you're going to get more digestive effects. You get more hydrochloric acid secretion in the stomach, increased muscle contraction in the bowel. Sometimes smokers may experience chronic diarrhea or colitis. And so you will also see things like increased metabolism. And because of the sympathetic effects, it often will suppress appetite. As a result, many smokers have a reduced weight. If they quit smoking, appetite increases because of the withdrawal effects. And what we're going to see is that many smokers gain a few pounds after they quit smoking. So all of these things contribute to potential heavy effects in high doses. In fact, in high doses, it's toxic. So as little as 60 milligrams can be fatal to an adult. So basically, a single pack of cigarettes has several lethal doses of a drug. Now remember that very little nicotine reaches the brain through smoking because of the burning tobacco and the smoke that's not inhaled by the smoker. But nicotine poisoning does happen. Usually this is going to happen by accidental swallowing of tobacco, sometimes in children or in pets. Nicotine exposure by this fruit is actually less toxic than you would expect because of the very slow absorption of the drug from the stomach through the first pass metabolism of the liver and the regurgitation of the tobacco that's remaining in the stomach. You can also get toxic effects. Oftentimes it's going to be more common in absorption of nicotine through the skin when field workers are harvesting wet tobacco leaves, or exposure to pure nicotine in certain types of insecticides. The first reported case of nicotine poisoning was a florist who came into contact with a nicotine-containing insecticide that he'd actually spilled onto a chair. So the symptoms of nicotine poisoning, which I don't have here, this includes nausea, excessive salivation, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, cold sweats, headaches, dizziness, disturbed hearing and vision, mental confusion, and weakness. This is later going to be followed by fainting, falling blood pressure, difficulty breathing, weakening of the pulse, and ultimately collapse. Now, if it is left untreated, fatal doses will end with convulsions, followed by respiratory failure due to that depolarization block that we talked about. Remember that these cells can't help when they're so highly stimulated. They're initially depolarized and then they're blockaded. So what's going to happen is the muscles of breathing are going to be blocked, and as a result, respiratory depression happens. If you want to treat nicotine poisoning, vomiting is kind of critical if it's been swallowed, placing charcoal in the stomach, artificial respiration, and treatment for shock. So we know that acute tolerance basically develops throughout the day. This tolerance reduces overnight, so people will often be most sensitive to the first cigarette of the day, and this is related to the desensitization of the nicotine receptors. And the amount of desensitization that you get depends on the subunits of the nicotinic receptor that are being stimulated. Generally, what we're going to find is that chronic tolerance develops with long-term use. Now, in non-smokers, high doses are going to elicit very strong aversive reactions. But in regular smokers, there is not going to be this kind of effect. And generally, what we are going to find is that chronic exposure leads to an upregulation of nicotinic receptors in the brain. So basically, the more that you smoke, the more nicotinic receptors are going to be created. So what you're looking at here in this figure is upregulation of nicotinic receptor binding in the prefrontal cortex. Particularly, we're looking at cortical layer 6. So here, these are post-mortem slices. You can see binding in a non-smoker. You see significantly more binding in a smoker, indicating that there was upregulation of these receptors so that more nicotine could bind to more receptors. And one of the other things that's kind of interesting historically is that cigarette smoking has actually varied over time. And it also tends to vary by gender. So the amount of cigarette smoking has really varied. It was very low at the beginning of the 20th century, but it rose steeply until about the 1950s. There was a very brief dip right around the 1950s when the first studies came out that linked smoking to lung cancer, but cigarette manufacturers basically started adding filtered cigarettes. So it was basically, well, we know this can potentially cause problems. Let us filter these cigarettes so that less tar enters the bloodstream and the lungs. So you get this little dip after those first studies, but once filtered cigarettes are marketed, you can kind of see consumption rises again. By 1964, the Surgeon General's report on smoking occurs and talking about the health consequences of smoking. And as you can kind of see, it begins to peak and then starts dropping off. So we have a further drop when the world's first anti-smoking ads are produced, when the cigarette tax doubles in 1983. So generally, a very small percent of the population are current cigarette smokers at the time. The last I heard, it was about 12% or maybe a little bit higher. Cigarette smoking is often going to be more prevalent in men than in women, in non-college graduates compared with college graduates, and in unemployed individuals compared to employed individuals. If we look at racial and ethnic breakdowns, the highest rate of smoking is reported by Native Americans, as well as Alaska Natives, followed by people who are white, Black Americans, Latina Americans, and then finally Asian Americans. Now, a couple of other things that we find is that in addition to men smoking more than women, there are also gender differences in different aspects related to smoking. Women smoke fewer cigarettes per day, They tend to prefer cigarettes with less nicotine, like light cigarettes. And additionally, they don't inhale as deeply. We also do find that women are more influenced by, or than men are, by the non-nicotine aspects of smoking, maybe the sensory factors or the social factors. And generally, women are going to find it more difficult to quit smoking. And we're not exactly sure why this happens. Now, smoking is usually going to start in adolescence. That's when most people pick up the habit. My partner is a smoker. He was in his teens. My sister is a smoker. She now uses e-cigarettes. She was a teenager, basically found my mom's cigarettes, and my mom was a teenager as well. So most smokers are going to pick it up during adolescence. And generally, early smoking increases the likelihood that you will smoke as an adult. So teenage smoking has often gotten a lot of attention from PSAs and things like that. Now, there are some different theories as to why teenagers start smoking. It could be that they want to be independent. They are trying to prove that they're more mature. They want to improve their self-image and their social acceptance, counteracting stress, boredom, or curiosity. Young people tend to emphasize the positive elements of smoking. They tend to disregard or deny the negative aspects. Now, early experimentation can lead to some different outcomes. So you can have initiated or tried. You can have experimentation. You can be a regular smoker, or you can be an established smoker. So there are some differences between a regular smoker and an established smoker. A regular smoker smokes on a regular basis. Maybe they only smoke on the weekends or at parties, but not frequently and not daily. Established smokers are people that really have the habit. These are people that smoke every day or almost daily. These are the people that are most likely to be nicotine dependent. Now, there are several different factors that maintain a smoking habit. So one of the first things is stress. A lot of people report that smoking causes relaxation, alleviation of stress, and it helps with our ability to concentrate. And there are two major advantages that a lot of people report: greater mood control and the enhancement of concentration. So this particular one is what is referred to as the nicotine resource model. It helps them control their mood and it helps them focus. Another model is called the deprivation reversal model, and it basically says that the positive effects of smoking are actually getting rid of the irritability and stress and the poor concentration that people tend to experience between their cigarette doses. We do know that abstinence increases cravings, but most symptoms of withdrawal are gone within 4 weeks. Now, one of the things that makes this very, very difficult is that there is some secondary reinforcement that occurs from smelling the smoke that may induce craving. And this can be very hard. And that can potentially induce priming and ultimately make the cigarette smoker want to smoke again, even if they've been abstinent for a little bit. So how do we treat this? So smoking is one of the leading causes of preventable death. It is very strongly linked with cancer, particularly lung cancer. As a result, treatment can kind of help. And we do this in a few different ways. First of all, we have different types of behavioral interventions. We put warnings on cigarette packs, and we have people pay higher taxes. The idea is that if this is too expensive for you, you may not be able to afford to keep up the habit. Counseling may also play a role, but what's probably going to work best for most people are what are known as nicotine replacement methods. So this would include things like lozenges, patches, or gum. Additionally, I have heard, and I kind of mentioned it in one of my forum posts this week, I actually just learned that you can vape or smoke an e-cigarette that has a fluid that does not actually contain nicotine. So you're getting some of the reinforcing effects of the ritual, but you're not actually getting the drug, and that can be a type of a replacement method. So now we're moving on to talking about caffeine. So I have another quote for you. This comes from Thomas Pynchon's book, Mason and Dixon. Au contraire, Dixon replies, coffee is an art where precision is all. Water temperature, mean particle diameter, ratio of coffee to water, or as we say, CTW, and dozens more variables I'd mention were they not so clearly out of the technical grasp. Another thing that I saw that I really resonate with, a bumper sticker I saw a long time ago, drink coffee, do stupid things faster with more energy. So caffeine is the world's most used drug. This is it. And generally, the major source is going to come from coffee beans under the species names Coffea arabica. Tea leaves also contain caffeine, and as I've talked about before, they contain theophylline. In the United States, it's been estimated that about 80 to 90% of adults regularly drink caffeinated beverages. And I want to kind of share with you some very common things that contain caffeine. So here you can see a list of typical caffeine content of common food items and drugs. Remember, caffeine is present in chocolate, but here you can see instant coffee, brewed coffee. If you get a black coffee or an espresso, that's going to have even more. If you get a Starbucks breakfast blend, particularly its venti size, which is about 20 ounces, you can kind of see the typical value, but the range is also reported here as well. Tea has considerably less caffeine, as does iced tea, hot chocolate. Coca-Cola has a little bit less than a cup of coffee, and then dark chocolate. Now, sports gels and bars may contain caffeine to help give athletes energy. Drugs like NoDoz may also have about 200 milligrams per tablet. And extra strength Excedrin, which is a pain reliever, has about 65 per tablet. Monster energy drinks tend to have about 240 milligrams in 24 ounces. Red Bull has about 80 milligrams in 8.5 ounces. Dr. Gilchrist's beloved Mountain Dew and diet derivatives have about 54 milligrams in about 12 ounces, about what you would find in a cup of coffee. I share a few more with you because the caffeine, the different types of energy drinks have rapidly increased in number since I first taught this class in 2017 and basically even since 2021, the last time I taught it. So if you get an Alani Nu, that's about 200 milligrams of caffeine. If you get a Bang, that's about 300 milligrams. Celsius is about 200 milligrams. Ghost is about 200 milligrams. C4 Energy is 200 milligrams. The Mountain Dew Rise, like the morning Mountain Dew, is about 180 milligrams. Rain is about 300 milligrams. Nos is about 160 milligrams. Rockstar is about 160 milligrams. So you can see here that a lot of these energy drinks have a significantly higher caffeine content. And if we say that brewed coffee on average is about 80 per cup, that basically means you are drinking, especially in the cases of something like Bang, you are drinking about 3 cups of coffee in 1 can of Bang. Now, the primary route of administration is oral in nature. I have never heard of anybody trying to IV inject their caffeine. So it's going to be consumed orally through the beverages in which it's present. Basically, this is going to be completely absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract in about 30 to 60 minutes. Now, you might be asking yourself, Dr. Gilchrist, sometimes coffee perks me up pretty quickly. Why are you saying it takes 30 to 60 minutes? Well, some caffeine, when you drink it, does enter the blood vessels through the mucous membranes in your mouth. And as a result, those access the bloodstream much quicker than the rest of the caffeine that is absorbed in the gastrointestinal tract. So you'll start to feel some small perking up right away, but you're not going to get that full effect until about half an hour to an hour after you drink it. Now, caffeine absorption usually begins in the stomach, but it is going to largely take place within the small intestine. Now, the plasma half-life is going to vary from person to person, but generally the average half-life is about 4 hours, which means that after about 3 half-lives, that takes about 12 hours. So consequently, if you are drinking coffee or caffeinated sodas or energy drinks over the course of the day, you are going to experience increasing plasma levels throughout the day, and this is going to be cleared after sleep. So something that's kind of interesting, the rate of plasma clearance is stimulated by smoking, and it's reduced when smoking is terminated. So it's part of the reason why people sometimes will smoke cigarettes when they drink coffee. Like caffeine can be really anxiety provoking at high levels, so the cigarettes can be used to calm somebody down. Now, animals and humans are affected differently by caffeine. With animals, they get initial stimulant effects in low doses, but when they get those higher doses, they don't seem to like it and their activity reduces. Humans show something a little bit different. With very high doses, you get increased tension and anxiety and stress. Low doses are going to have stimulating effects. Now, here's the thing. Yes, caffeine is a drug, but it actually has a variety of different positive effects. So we actually do find that caffeine improves well-being, it enhances vigor, and it leads to better concentration. So what you're looking at here is an effect of caffeine consumption, both on caffeine consumers and non-caffeine consumers with respect to a vigilance task. So basically, you have to sustain your attention of a digit that's on the screen. So here, what we kind of see is that generally people who are consumers of caffeine, but they get a placebo, they don't really do a very good job of noticing the number of hits. Notice that when caffeine consumers are given caffeine, their focus gradually increases. They can concentrate better. Now, here's a non-consumer with the placebo. They look very much like the caffeine consumer. The non-caffeine consumer that is given caffeine focuses even better than regular caffeine consumers. We do also find that caffeine consumption can enhance athletic performance, which is why it tends to show up in a lot of pre-workout. Researchers have found that caffeine provides better opportunities for the muscles to contract, better alertness, and reduced pain. But there are going to be some acute physiological effects on the body. So we are going to see some cardiovascular things. You are going to have increased respiration and increased blood pressure. This is especially true for some people who are very sensitive to caffeine. I have occasionally gone in and had my blood pressure taken right after having a Mountain Dew, and they're like, "Oh, you're elevated," or "You're borderline." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I had coffee," or "I had a Mountain Dew." So if you know that you're going to have your blood pressure taken, I would encourage you, don't drink caffeine until after, because it might temporarily increase your blood pressure as a result. Additionally, one of the things that I was always told is that caffeine is a diuretic, and it is. It is going to make you excrete more, especially water. It is a diuretic. But one of the things that I was often told with caffeine is that it dehydrates you. You need to drink actual water because caffeine will dehydrate you. And it turns out, researchers have looked at this. Coffee and sodas that have caffeine are not dehydrating in the way that we believed. Now, should you try to focus on drinking more water? Yes, but it is not going to dehydrate you. Additionally, one of the other things that we know is that it stimulates catecholamine release, particularly epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands. So you are going to get a little bit of sympathetic nervous system activation. And you can develop a tolerance, particularly on some of the different subjective effects. So heavy coffee drinkers can actually drink caffeine before bedtime with no effect on their sleep. But for a lot of people, a cup of coffee before bed is going to cause like fitful sleep with a lot of tossing and turning. And generally, chronic caffeine use is also going to produce tolerance to its cardiovascular and its respiratory effects. Now, one of the things that you might experience while you do not necessarily have a very strong physical dependence on caffeine, you may experience withdrawal effects if you miss your morning cup of coffee. And this will include things like headache, fatigue, poor concentration, maybe some mild anxiety or depression. This is a very common type of drug dependence. It's generally going to be harmless. And generally, you might have a craving for coffee, and this can occur with individuals who are consuming as little as 100 milligrams a day, which is basically a 6-ounce cup of regular coffee or 3 cans of a caffeinated soft drink. So that's something to kind of be aware of. Now, too much caffeine can really be dangerous to people. Caffeineism is basically, it can occur at about 1,000 milligrams per day. This is going to be characterized by restlessness, nervousness, insomnia, psychological disturbances like tachycardia, and gastrointestinal upset. But it's going to look really similar to an anxiety disorder. Now, one of the things that I would kind of argue, and again, in your forum this week, you're going to read a paper that argues differently, caffeine, you can really like a lot of the way that it makes you feel, but it doesn't really have the same type of addictive properties that we see in things that have stronger physical dependencies, things like alcohol, things like opioids. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, one of the things that I'm going to close up on, caffeine does not directly influence catecholamine systems. So how it works has largely been unclear for a while. At first, people thought that it was involved with cyclic AMP, but it turns out that isn't the case. Researchers also looked at maybe blocking GABA receptors were involved, inhibition of phosphodiesterase, which is not only involved in vision, but it breaks down other types of cyclic AMP. People also looked at whether it enhances calcium release. And as you can kind of see here, we have concentration of caffeine, and then we have the effect, and you can see that you have to have a massive amount of caffeine before any of these things really start to happen. So that's not what is happening to have caffeine have the stimulating effects that they do. So ultimately, researchers have found that it's adenosine that seems to play a role here. As you can kind of see, 1 cup of coffee or higher doses of caffeine do seem to antagonize the adenosine receptors. So basically, blocking those receptors is what gives caffeine its stimulating effects. Oftentimes, adenosine receptors are going to play a role in sleep. Caffeine basically is going to cause a blockade of these receptors, which is going to basically create that feeling of alertness. So folks, that is all I had for this week. I will see you next week. Bye, everybody.